Every year on the 17th of March, a specific kind of madness takes over the streets of New York, Boston, and Chicago. It's a visual assault of emerald, green hats, green carnations, even green rivers. We've collectively agreed that this is the uniform of celebration. We've even invented a little game of social policing around it. If you aren't wearing the color, you get pinched. We tell our children it's because green makes you invisible to leprechauns who apparently spend their Tuesdays looking for people to harass. It's a light-hearted, slightly annoying tradition that feels as old as the hills of Ireland themselves. But when I spent a rainy Tuesday in a basement archive in Philadelphia, looking through shipping manifests and personal journals from the late 18th century, I realized that the pinch isn't a game. It's a survivor's reflex. And the color we all wear with such casual abandon was, for a very long time, the last thing a sane person would ever put on their back if they wanted to stay alive. I'm looking at a ledger from 1790. The ink is faded, a dull brown against parchment that feels like dried skin. It's a record of disorderly elements, a polite term used by the authorities of the time to describe the Irish immigrants who were beginning to fill the tenements of the American colonies and the newly formed United States. In these pages, there is no mention of the luck of the Irish. There is only a persistent mounting fear, and what struck me most was the description of the symbols these people carried. In 1790, if you were celebrating the patron saint of Ireland, you weren't looking for a four-leaf clover. You were looking for a specific shade of sky blue. We've been sold a version of history that has been bleached and dyed for mass consumption. The original color of St. Patrick had nothing to do with the lush grass of the island. It was blue, a deep, regal St. Patrick's blue that adorned the Knights of the Order of St. Patrick, established in 1783. It was the color of the sky over the Atlantic, a symbol of sovereignty and calm. Blue was the establishment. Blue was the color of the saint, as recognized by the crown. When you see old depictions of Patrick from the medieval period, he isn't a man in a green robe. He's draped in blue. So, how did we get here? How did a nation and its massive diaspora across the US and the UK abandon the regal blue for a color that, in 1790, was considered the mark of a radical, a rebel, and a hunted man? The shift didn't happen because of a marketing campaign or a love for the landscape. It happened because of blood. I found a series of letters in that same 1790 file, written by a man who had fled Dublin for the docks of New York. He spoke of the wearing of the green, not as a festive choice, but as a silent, dangerous oath. In the late 1700s, the Society of United Irishmen began to use green as their rallying cry. They chose it specifically because it was the opposite of the blue and red of the British crown. It was a color of defiance. But in the eyes of the law, both in the UK and in the early American territories still heavily influenced by British sentiment, wearing green was a confession. It was an admission that you belonged to a subclass that wanted to upend the order of things. In America, this took on a darker, more localized flavor. We like to imagine the US as a melting pot that welcomed the Irish with open arms. But the 1790 records tell a different story. The Irish were the other. They were the labor force that lived in the shadows, and their traditions were viewed with deep suspicion. To wear green on March 17th in a city like New York in the late 18th century wasn't an act of pride, it was a provocation. It was a way of identifying yourself to your allies while simultaneously painting a bullseye on your chest for the nativist mobs and the local constabulary. The pinch we joke about today? That started as a warning. It was a physical reminder to stay invisible. If you weren't wearing the green, you were safe. You could blend into the blue-blooded crowd. But if you chose to wear the color of the rebellion, you had to be ready for the consequences. I remember sitting in that archive, the hum of the city outside feeling miles away, and realizing that we have completely inverted the meaning of the day. We wear green now to belong, to join the party, to be part of the in group. But the people who first brought this tradition to American shores wore it to declare they would never belong to the system that oppressed them. They wore it knowing it made them targets. I found a specific entry from a magistrate in 1790 describing a small gathering in a tavern near the Hudson River. He wrote about the insolence of the green ribbon pinned to a young man's lapel. That ribbon wasn't a festive accessory. It was a piece of fabric that could get him beaten, imprisoned, or worse. There's a tension in that realization that I can't shake. We've turned a badge of the hunted into a costume. We've taken a color that represented a literal life and death struggle for identity and turned it into something you wear so you don't get teased at the office. But the archives don't lie. They show a period where the transition from blue to green was marked by riots and secret meetings. The green wasn't just a color, it was a territory. It was a psychological space where the Irish-American identity was being forged in the heat of exclusion. As I dug deeper into the 1790 records, I found a mention of a lost celebration. It wasn't a parade, it was a day of the blue mantle, a quiet religious observation that the older generation tried to cling to. They wanted the blue. They wanted the respectability, the peace, the connection to the old, recognized saint. But the youth, the ones who were building the railroads, digging the canals, and living 3 families to a room, they wanted the green. They wanted the color that screamed their presence. They were tired of being invisible in blue. They chose to be hunted in green. I started to wonder about the specific moment the blue was finally buried. There was a meeting, recorded in a fragmented diary I found, where a group of Irishmen in Philadelphia debated whether to carry a blue banner or a green one for their St. Patrick's Day walk. One man argued that blue would keep the peace with the city fathers. Another man, whose name was smeared by a water stain, stood up and said that peace was just another word for silence. He wanted the green. He wanted the city to see them, even if the city hated what it saw. That choice, visibility over safety, is the heartbeat of the Irish-American story. But it carries a ghost with it. A ghost that suggests that by wearing green today, we are participating in a memory we don't fully understand. We are wearing the uniform of the hunted, but we've forgotten what it feels like to be the prey. And as I looked at the final pages of that 1790 ledger, I saw a list of names, men and women who had been detained for wearing seditious colors. The color wasn't just green. It was a specific dark shade that they called the Sham's hue. It was meant to be a slur. It was meant to mock the shamrock, a plant the authorities saw as a weed. But the Irish took that weed and made it a shield. They took the hunted status and turned it into a tribe. The irony is that today, if you wore the original St. Patrick's blue to a parade, you'd be the one getting pinched. You'd be the outsider. We have successfully erased the original color of the saint and replaced it with the color of the struggle. But in doing so, we've lost the weight of why the struggle happened in the first place. I wanted to know what happened to that young man in the New York tavern, the one with the insolent green ribbon. I wanted to know if he knew he was starting a fire that would eventually dye an entire culture emerald. Because the record doesn't end with his arrest. It ends with a question that makes me look at every green beer and plastic clover with a sense of profound unease. It makes me wonder, if the color was meant to make them invisible to their enemies, why are we using it to make ourselves so loud? I tracked that question through the 19th century, following the trail of green from the damp docks of Liverpool to the crowded tenements of Lower Manhattan. What I found was a shift in the very chemistry of the color. Before the late 1700s, if you had asked a person in Dublin what color represented their patron saint, they wouldn't have pointed to the grass. They would have pointed to the sky. St. Patrick's blue was the standard. It was a deep, authoritative indigo, a color of the establishment, of the Knights of the Order of St. Patrick. It was the color of the good Irishmen, the ones who stayed within the lines drawn by the British Crown. Blue was the color of compliance, but something broke in the 1790s. I found the records of the United Irishmen, a group that decided they were tired of being subjects. They needed a symbol that wasn't a hand-me-down from royalty. They looked at the landscape, at the clover that grew in the cracks of the stone walls, and they chose green. It was a radical, jarring departure. They called it the wearing of the green, and suddenly a simple piece of fabric became a death warrant. In the eyes of the authorities, a green ribbon wasn't just a decoration, it was a confession of treason. I read an account from a British officer stationed in Belfast in 1798 who described the sullenness of the local women who began dyeing their petticoats green in secret. They were turning their very clothes into a silent scream for independence. When the Great Famine hit in the 1840s and the coffin ships began dumping thousands of starving souls onto the piers of New York and Boston, they brought that seditious color with them. But in America, the meaning changed again. It became the color of the greenhorn. It was a slur for the unseasoned, the dirty, the unwanted. I found a series of police blotters from the Five Points district in New York, dated 1851. They didn't use names for half the people they arrested. They just wrote Irish male, wearing green rags. The color had become synonymous with poverty and the perceived threat of a foreign invasion. In the mid-1800s, wearing green on March 17th in a city like Philadelphia or Boston wasn't a festive choice. It was a target. I found a forgotten incident from 1854 involving a group of men known as the Know-Nothings. They were a nativist, anti-immigrant political party that thrived on the fear of the other. On St. Patrick's Day that year, they didn't just ignore the Irish, they hunted them. They looked for the green. If they saw a man with a green sash or a woman with a green shawl, they took it as a provocation. It was a sign that these people refused to disappear into the American blue. The violence was systematic. They would wait outside the Catholic churches, watching for the color of the clover, and then they would descend. There's a specific report from a Boston hospital in the archives, listing the injuries of 14 men who had been beaten near the harbor. The common thread? Every single one of them had been wearing a green ribbon pinned to their coat. The doctor noted that one man refused to let them cut the ribbon off, even as they were stitching his wounds. He called it his second skin. That's when it hit me. We think we wear green today to show pride, but the ancestors wore it as a form of scar tissue. It was the only thing they had left that the New World couldn't take away, even if it meant they'd be recognized and attacked for it. I started looking into the folklore of the pinch, that annoying little tradition where we pinch anyone not wearing green on the 17th. The modern explanation is that green makes you invisible to leprechauns, who supposedly pinch anyone they can see. It's a cute, sanitized story for children. But the older record suggests something much darker. The pinch wasn't a game. It was a warning. In the secret societies of the 19th century Irish underground, like the Molly Maguires or the Fenian Brotherhood, you had to identify yourself. If you weren't wearing the green on the designated days, you were suspected of being an informant. You were suspected of turning blue. The pinch was a physical check, a way to see if you were still part of the tribe or if you had sold out to the authorities. It was a test of loyalty in a world where being a traitor meant a shallow grave. The transition from blue to green wasn't a natural evolution of taste. It was a violent, forced rebranding. The blue of the saint was the blue of the cage. The green of the people was the green of the rebellion. But as the Irish began to gain political power in American cities, as they became the police officers, the mayors, the fire chiefs, the color began to lose its edge. It was colonized by the very system that once tried to ban it. By the early 1900s, the seditious green was being used to sell beer and greeting cards. The uniform of the hunted became the costume of the partygoer. I found a letter from an Irish immigrant in Chicago, written in 1912, that perfectly captures this unease. He wrote to his brother back in Galway complaining about the first official parades organized by the city. He said, "They have taken our blood and turned it into a parade. They wear the green now, the same men who used to throw stones at us for it. It feels like a mockery. They wear the color, but they don't know the weight of the cloth." He saw the shift happening in real time. He saw the hunted status being traded for a seat at the table, and he realized that once everyone starts wearing your secret code, it's no longer a code. It's just a product. This led me to a specific document from a 1920s textile mill in Massachusetts. It was an order for St. Patrick's emerald green dye. The chemist noted that they had to adjust the formula because the original shamrock green, the dark, earthy, almost brownish green of the actual plant, was too depressing for the American consumer. They wanted something brighter, something that popped under the streetlights, something that looked like a celebration, not a struggle. So, they invented a new green, a neon synthetic version of a history that was originally written in mud and blood. When we put on that bright green shirt today, we aren't wearing the color of the Irish rebels. We're wearing a marketing department's version of it. We are wearing the safe version, but the records from 1790 still exist, tucked away in those cold folders, reminding us that there was a time when the color you chose determined whether you walked home that night or ended up in a cell. The irony is that the one color you should probably never wear on March 17th, if you actually want to honor the man the day is named after, is the very color we've all agreed is mandatory. The real St. Patrick is still trapped in that deep, cold blue, forgotten by a world that prefers the neon glow of the emerald. I wonder what that young man in the 1790 tavern would think if he saw a modern parade, if he saw the plastic beads and the green-dyed rivers. Would he feel victorious? Or would he feel like the invisibility he fought so hard for has finally been achieved? Not by hiding in the hills, but by being buried under a mountain of cheap green felt. The archive doesn't give me an answer, but it gives me a name. A name of a man who was executed in 1799 for possessing a green handkerchief. One handkerchief. That was the price of the color back then. And as I look at the sea of green every March, I can't help but feel like we're spending that inheritance without knowing where it came from. That handkerchief wasn't just a piece of fabric. In the eyes of the law in the late 1700s, it was a confession. I spent a long time looking at the deposition of a man named James, an Irishman who had migrated to the American colonies just before the turn of the century. He wasn't a soldier, he was a weaver. But in 1799, he was hauled before a magistrate because someone had spotted a sliver of green ribbon tucked inside his coat. The magistrate didn't ask about his faith. He didn't ask if he was celebrating a saint. He asked who James was meeting in the woods. He asked where the pikes were hidden. In that era, wearing green on March 17th, or any day really, wasn't an act of festive cheer. It was an act of high treason. It was the uniform of the hunted. When these men and women began pouring into the ports of New York and Boston a few decades later, they brought that trauma with them. We like to imagine the first St. Patrick's Day parades in America as grand celebrations of heritage, but the archives tell a much grittier story. In the mid-1800s, the green was a target. To the nativist mobs in cities like Philadelphia and New York, a man in a green jacket wasn't a neighbor celebrating his roots. He was a threat to the American way of life. He was the other. I found accounts from the 1844 Bible riots, where the mere sight of Irish symbols was enough to set entire blocks on fire. For the Irish American, wearing the green was a calculated risk. It was a way of saying, "I am still here," knowing full well that the statement might get you killed. It was a color worn by people who had been pushed to the edge of the map, people who were being hunted in the streets of the New World, just as they had been in the Old one. And yet, here is the ghost in the machine. While the rebels were being hunted for their green ribbons, the official, correct color of St. Patrick remained a calm, aristocratic blue. If you go to the dark, quiet corners of the Irish National Archives, or look at the early heraldry of the Order of St. Patrick founded in 1783, you won't find a trace of emerald. You'll find St. Patrick's blue. It's a deep sky-toned shade, cold and commanding. This was the color chosen by the British Crown to represent Ireland. It was the color of the state, the color of order, the color of the loyal Irishman. The blue was the silence of the establishment. The green was the scream of the street. So, when I say that green is the color you should never wear if you want to be historically accurate to the man himself, I'm talking about a fundamental disconnect in our collective memory. We have spent 2 centuries scrubbing the blue away because blue represented the very authorities that were doing the hunting. We chose the green of the rebels, the green of the mud, the green of the men who died in 1798. But in doing so, we've entered into a strange neon-lit contract with the past. We've taken a color that once meant, I am willing to die for this identity, and turned it into a color that means, I am looking for a cheap beer. I stood by the Chicago River a few years ago, watching them dump thousands of gallons of vegetable dye into the water. The river turned a shade of green that doesn't exist in nature, a glowing, radioactive hue that looked more like a mistake than a tradition. Thousands of people stood on the bridges, cheering for the spectacle. Most of them were wearing plastic hats and Kiss Me I'm Irish shirts in that same synthetic shade. I kept thinking about the record from 1790. I kept thinking about the weaver who was interrogated over a ribbon. To him, that river wouldn't look like a celebration. It would look like a crime scene. It would look like the ultimate victory of the state. Not to ban the color, but to make it so common, so loud, and so meaningless that the history behind it simply evaporates. The real danger of the modern March 17th isn't that we're wearing the wrong color. It's that we're wearing a color that has no weight left. We've traded the hunted green for a safe green. We've traded the deep, sovereign blue of the saint for a marketing gimmick. If you want to truly honor the history of that date, perhaps you should look for a piece of blue fabric. Wear the color that the world forgot. Wear the color that represented the man before he was turned into a mascot. Or, if you must wear green, wear the dark, muted shade of the forest where the United Irishmen hid. Wear the color that actually cost someone something. I'm closing this file now. The archives are getting cold and the sun is going down. Every year we repeat these rituals without asking why. We put on the uniform because everyone else is wearing it, never realizing that the uniform was once a death warrant. We think we're remembering, but most of the time we're just participating in a very long, very successful erasure. The next time you reach for that green shirt on March 17th, just remember, there was a time when that simple choice would have made you a ghost. Maybe that's the real secret of the calendar. We don't celebrate the past. We celebrate our escape from it. We wear the green because we no longer have to fear being hunted for it. But in that safety, we've lost the blue. We've lost the saint. And we've lost the truth about what it actually costs to stand in the light. That's the end of the file for today. Go look at your own calendar. See what else is hiding in plain sight. That's the end.